we are witnessing the end of American leadership on the world stage. In fact, we've probably been witnessing this for about a decade now. Our allies appear to no longer trust us, our enemies no longer fear us, and our population at home no longer wants to support being the global leader. At least this is all the perception of what's happening right now, and we're going to dissect whether or not this is actually valid. Already, our allies in Europe are working to decouple their security from the United States. Yes, this has been a long time coming, and yes, this will be very expensive and difficult for them to do, but they're trying to do it anyway. They appear to see the writing on the wall, that the US is not willing to underwrite their security for much longer. However, our enemies don't fear us either. One of Putin's justifications for why he chose to invade Ukraine in 2022 of any time is because of the disastrous withdrawal from Afghanistan by the US. He thought that the US did not have the it factor anymore, and he thought that he would be relatively unchallenged in Ukraine. He was wrong. However, the way that the US has gone about Ukraine has more or less reinforced this idea within Tehran and Beijing. Putin, and now it appears Xi, do not fear the United States, and that might invite more conflict into the next few years. And finally, and I think most importantly here, the American people no longer want to bear the responsibility of being the world leaders. This is nothing new in US politics. This has really been the case ever since the US found itself as the global superpower. People have always been wary of being the world police and sending their children off to die in foreign wars that don't really seem to have anything to do with the US. However, this is becoming a bigger and bigger issue now. The economy, domestic fracturing, and political frustrations are all top of mind. And whether the United States wants to continue to be the world leaders, or whether our allies even want us to still be the world leaders, it really doesn't matter if the people can't sustain it. So we're going to talk about all of this and whether all of these are actually true statements or what is actually going on. We're going to talk about how we got here, where we are today, and what might be next in the future. And first, let me do a quick plug for the Patreon. We'll talk a little bit more in detail about this later in the video, but if you're interested in weekly briefs on the top 5 international news stories from the previous week, then check out my Patreon. I also include my assessments on what is actually going on and what could be next. There's a link down in the description for that. At the end of World War II, the United States emerged not just victorious, but with unprecedented levels of power. With much of Europe and Asia devastated, America stood as the world's economic powerhouse, commanding half of the world's GDP and possessing unparalleled military strength. But American leaders knew that true power required more than dominance. It required legitimacy, and thus began the crafting of what is known today as the US-led global world order, anchored in institutions that are designed to ensure a lasting peace and prosperity for everybody. The United Nations promised diplomatic security. The Bretton Woods system ensured economic growth through institutions like the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank. NATO offered collective security for US allies in Europe. The United States became the arsenal of democracy. This was the case pre-war as well, but even more so after the war, laying the foundation for decades of global stability relative to the time before World War II. But this post-war peace was incredibly fragile and prone to some small-scale fractures. As the Soviet Union expanded its influence, America's role shifted from peacekeeper to protector against communism. The Cold War era saw the U.S. champion a strategy of containment, providing billions of dollars in aid through the Marshall Plan to rebuild Europe, bolstering alliances across the globe, and fighting proxy wars from Korea to Vietnam. This prolonged ideological struggle between capitalism and communism not only defined American foreign policy, but also reinforced America's moral legitimacy as the leader of the free world, clearly juxtaposed against the evil Soviet authoritarianism. However, this also led to some pretty significant missteps in U.S. foreign policy. For example, of course, there's a lot of different missteps during the Vietnam War that everybody's already aware of. A lot of other coups that took place around the world through Latin America and across Asia, trying to root out communism, but that ultimately led to even worse situations for the civilians on the ground. And then suddenly the Cold War was over. With the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, America stood alone as the unrivaled global superpower. This became a unipolar moment, and it was marked by unprecedented dominance. The US was able to intervene decisively in conflicts from the Balkans to the Persian Gulf. It drove economic globalization and led to the digital revolution that has reshaped the world. American culture, values, and policies all set the global agenda. The 1990s and early 2000s became an era defined by American influence, confidence, and optimism. But beneath this apparent triumph lay vulnerabilities that would soon become impossible for anyone to ignore. In 2007, Vladimir Putin gave a speech at the Munich Security Conference that openly challenged the US-dominated global order, signaling Russia's rejection of America's unilateralism.
Считаю, что для современного мира однополярная модель не только неприемлема, но и вообще невозможно. И не только потому, что при единоличном лидерстве в современном, именно в современном мире не будет хватать ни военно-политических, ни экономических ресурсов. Но, что еще важнее, сама модель является неработающей, так как в ее основе нет и не может быть морально-нравственной базы современной цивилизации.
Soon after, Russia demonstrated its willingness to reclaim influence by force, invading Georgia in 2008, annexing Crimea later in 2014, and intervening within the Syrian civil war in 2015. Moscow's strategy expanded well beyond just conventional warfare to include disinformation campaigns, energy politics, and significant military modernization. These actions by Russia all sought to fracture Western alliances, diminish trust in the institutions the U.S. had built, and reestablish Russia's dominance within its own sphere of influence. Meanwhile, China embarked in remarkable economic growth that's transformed it into a formidable competitor. Since joining the World Trade Organization in 2001, China has rapidly become the world's manufacturing powerhouse, wielding economic influence globally. Under Xi Jinping, the Belt and Road Initiative began reshaping trade routes and political alignments, extending China's strategic reach worldwide. Militarily, China aggressively expanded its presence in the South China Sea, investing heavily in cyber capabilities and intensifying its threats and exercises around Taiwan. Concurrently, Beijing has established an alternative global institution like the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, promoted the BRICS coalition aimed at reducing global reliance on the US dollar, and has offered an alternative model to the Western-style governance and economic policies. These challenges from Russia and China resonated globally, as many nations grew frustrated with America's perceived unilateralism, from controversial wars like Iraq to economic sanctions and control over international financial systems like SWIFT. Increasingly, the idea of multipolar world order gained appeal as the counterbalance to the United States-led rules-based order. This new order prioritized national sovereignty over liberal democracy, state control over market liberalization, and regime stability over democratic ideals. A multipolar world order would see power dispersed among several dominant regional players rather than centralized under one global hegemon. This shift would create new geopolitical dynamics, increasing competition in regions and continents like Africa to the Arctic to cyberspace and space. Global institutions could still fragment under these different trade blocs, and this could fracture also security arrangements, digital ecosystems, and lead to less global coordination and more unpredictability. Ultimately, this new environment would reduce the United States' ability to shape global outcomes, ushering in a new era characterized by greater instability and uncertainty. To manage all of these brand new challenges, America has needed strong, wise leadership. And, well, let's talk about it. Donald Trump's election in 2016 marked a profound turning point in American politics and global leadership. Under the banner of America First, Trump openly rejected the foundational principles of a U.S.-led post-war order. Multilateralism, alliances, and international institutions were treated as burdens or threats to the United States rather than assets. At home, his administration accelerated institutional distrust, promoted conspiracy theories, and deepened polarization already simmering within American society. The result was an increasingly divided country that is unable to agree on basic facts, much less a coherent foreign policy. Globally, this impact was almost immediate. Long-standing allies were blindsided as Trump withdrew from the Paris climate agreements, questioned NATO commitments, and it launched trade wars within Europe and China alike. Democracy gave way to spectacle. Treaties replaced statecraft. Traditional U.S. partners began to hedge, questioning Washington's reliability. Meanwhile, authoritarian countries like Russia and China began to see an opening. They seized the moment to undermine liberal norms, test red lines, and to expand their influence as America turned inward. Russia intervened in Syria, China began testing the South China Sea and Taiwan, and Iran expanded its operations all across the Middle East. The world watched, not with fear, but with a lot of confusion, and began preparing for a future where American leadership could no longer be taken for granted. And then, of course, COVID hit and Joe Biden entered office, and he promised a return to normalcy, an effort to restore alliances, rejoin international agreements, and reclaim America's role as the global leader. From rejoining the Paris Climate Accord to reaffirming commitments to NATO and leading G7 efforts on pandemic recovery and democracy promotion, Biden's administration attempted to show that America is back, but the response was mixed. Allies welcomed the change in tone, but were not convinced the U.S. could be relied upon long term. The damage from Trump's first term had left a lot of scars, and many feared that America's commitment to international order would be reversed again with another election. Despite this democratic reset, signs of American fragility still remained. President Biden's age and frequent communication stumbles raised a lot of concerns about his leadership stamina and his physical health, both at home and abroad. Leaks from within the intelligence and defense communities also exposed some significant internal fractures that undermined strategic messaging. More broadly, though, the world began to see the United States as a superpower in visible decline. Still powerful, but less coherent, less stable, and increasingly paralyzed by domestic dysfunction. In many capitals, some quiet conversations began around this time. Could the era of reliable American leadership truly be over? And that takes us to more or less where we are today. But before we do all that, there's a word from today's video sponsor, and that's me. I'm launching a Patreon to support this channel. This will help me to pay for video editing and other key capabilities that help me to grow the quality of these videos and potentially one day the quantity of these videos. And because of that, I'm not going to ask for donations here. And yes, I do have a Buy Me a Coffee if that's interesting to you. I don't market that because I would rather just provide some sort of additional service in return for your support. And that's all in addition to the free YouTube content that I'm making here right now. This, of course, takes me to the Patreon, where my members will receive weekly intelligence reports made by me on the top 5 international stories from the previous week. The analyst tier will receive this report, as well as receiving access to my videos early and weekly recognition at the end of every video. The senior analyst tier will receive all of those benefits, and they will also receive a monthly priority topic request that will be covered in greater depth in the following weekly report. So if you are somebody that's planning to travel somewhere and you want to know about the security situation in that place, or you have a business interest somewhere, or you're just curious about something, you can pop that question or that topic request into the membership. I'll do some research on it and I will present it in the next report for the group. I'll probably be adding more features to this in the future as we move along, but this is what I'm starting with right now. New analyst members will receive their first 7 days for free, so you can kind of see what we've got going so far and see if this is something that you're interested in before you actually commit. Check the link to the Patreon down in the video description for more. With all that, back to the video. President Trump's second term has reignited domestic upheaval reminiscent of his first time in office. His administration's aggressive tariff policies have sparked legal challenges from multiple U.S. states, which argue that tariffs imposed under the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, or the IEEPA, are an overreach of executive authority. These legal battles have intensified political polarization and raised concerns about the stability of democratic institutions. Furthermore, the administration's governance style, characterized by abrupt policy shifts and personal vendettas, has led to a climate of uncertainty. This not only impacts our political institutions, but it also obviously impacts our economic institutions as well. And all of this has led to concerns about an upcoming recession. The unpredictability has strained relations between federal and state governments, as well as between the executive branch and other institutions, all contributing to a growing sense of domestic instability. Internationally, Trump's policies have prompted allies and adversaries alike to reassess their strategy. Trump's imposition of sweeping tariffs has disrupted global trade. In April 2025, the administration announced a 10% tariff on all imports, with higher rates for countries with significant trade deficits with the US like China, Mexico, and Canada. These measures have all led to retaliatory tariffs, escalating trade tensions and contributing to inflationary pressures within the US economy. In a significant policy shift, Trump has reduced US involvement in the Russia-Ukraine conflict as well. He's expressed a desire to prioritize trade relations with Russia over continued support for Ukraine. And this has led to concerns among European allies about the US's commitment to NATO and European security. This approach has been criticized as appeasement, potentially emboldening Russian aggression in Europe. The administration's approach to Iran has been marked by mixed signals. While reimposing the maximum pressure campaign with increased sanctions, Trump is simultaneously engaged in negotiations for a new nuclear agreement. However, by the time you're watching this video, those negotiations may or may not have yielded fruit. The cumulative effect of these policies has been a decline in global trust in American leadership. Allies are increasingly seeking to diversify their strategic partnerships, reducing reliance on the US. Adversaries are exploiting this perceived weakness, testing the boundaries of US influence. And all of this is really just reinforcing and indicating a moving shift towards a multipolar world order, with the US no longer being the unchallenged global leader. Instead, we're seeing more and more the world that Putin and Xi Jinping both have envisioned for the world. The world is no longer waiting for American permission to act. From Beijing to Moscow, New Delhi to Ankara, regional powers are carving out new roles on the global stage, no longer aspiring to join the American-led order, but instead trying to bypass or even replace it. China continues to anchor its influence through the Belt and Road Initiative and digital infrastructure, effectively redrawing the map of economic dependency. India is pursuing a uniquely non-aligned path, maintaining military ties with the US while purchasing oil and other kinds of materials from Russia and leading initiatives in the global south. The European Union is crafting its own industrial policy and strategic autonomy doctrine, with France and Germany now openly debating defense independence from NATO. Even smaller powers like Turkey or the UAE are playing balancing games, cutting deals with China, Russia, and the US alike. At an institutional level, organizations like the BRICS Bank and the Shanghai Cooperation Organization are expanding both in influence and membership. Their success signals growing dissatisfaction with the post-World War II frameworks dominated by the US and the IMF and the World Bank. Multipolarity isn't just a forecast, it's becoming the status quo. And for the United States, this transformation raises a fundamental question. Is the decline of unipolarity a relief or a threat? There's an argument to be made that shredding the world police mantle could allow America to refocus inward. After decades of costly foreign interventions and overextension, Washington could reallocate resources towards rebuilding infrastructure, fixing domestic inequality, and restoring faith in democracy. No longer bearing the sole responsibility for global stability might sound like a welcome break. But in reality, multipolarity looks a lot less like freedom and more like diminished influence. America's strategic tools are weakening. The dollar is facing pressure as rival states conduct more trade in yuan, euros, or local currencies. The global internet is fracturing into separate spheres of technological governance. The threat of U.S. secondary sanctions no longer deters China, India, or the Gulf states from cutting deals with sanctioned actors like Russia or Iran. The tools that once guaranteed obedience, like financial access, military access, and market integration, now provoke resistance. The world isn't simply drifting from U.S. leadership, it is in many cases actively insulating itself from it. Multipolarity is not a death sentence for American influence, but it does demand a different kind of leadership. If the U.S. wants to remain globally relevant, it must evolve from hegemon to a hub. And that means building coalitions on shared interests, not blind loyalty. It means embracing economic interdependence rather than trying to control it. It means leading by example on climate, tech ethics, on democratic governance, rather than coercion. And this adaptation would also require a political transformation here at home as well. Hyperpartisan dysfunction, election denialism, institutional decay, these are not just domestic problems. These are institutional liabilities. Allies watch Capitol Hill and the Supreme Court as closely as they watch Tehran or Pyongyang. For America to lead abroad, it must first stabilize itself. The future will not be defined by a single power calling the shots. It will be shaped by networks, alliances, and strategic convergence. The US can still be a cornerstone of that system, but only if it understands the game. Power today is distributed, not concentrated. And in this new reality, relevance is earned, not assumed. For decades, America claimed the mantle of global leadership with the assumption that the public supported it. That assumption, however, is cracking. Recent polls have showed that US voters are less interested in maintaining global dominance. Majorities now say that the US should focus on domestic problems rather than trying to solve international ones. After 2 decades of inconclusive wars and overseas engagements, Americans are tired and skeptical. America First wasn't just a campaign slogan, it tapped into something deeply felt across the political spectrum. For most Americans, foreign affairs are no longer a top priority. They're worried about the economy, from inflation, housing, debt, and job insecurity, and they're also worried about domestic crises like immigration, public safety, school systems, and healthcare. In this context, foreign aid and military spending often looks less like an investment and more like waste. And it doesn't help that there's also a lot of waste. This is not just about money, it's about trust. The same voters who lost faith in Washington's ability to manage the economy, protect democratic norms, or govern fairly are also questioning why that same government should be leading the world. It's just a logical progression of the same questions that have been asked for years now. If the US can't get its own house in order, then why should it be in charge of anyone else's? And so the consensus that once underpinned Americans' foreign policy has fractured. Without the public mandate, serious leadership is very hard to sustain. No grand strategy can succeed if the voters themselves don't understand it, support it, or believe that it even benefits them at all. What we're witnessing now is not just a crisis of leadership at the top. It's a shift in that the public is now unwilling to empower it. Recent conflicts have only increased public frustration with foreign policy. The US supported Ukraine, but only did so by drip feeding supplies, leaking war plans, and delaying very important military aid. Even whenever the aid did reach Ukraine, the US applied limits to its use, and it poorly communicated why any of this was happening at all in the first place. People that have paid attention to the war in Ukraine, that have watched this channel, all know this. But those who haven't think that the US has only sent about $350 billion in cash to Ukraine. That's not how any of that has worked, and we've talked about our aid to Ukraine on this channel and how it really works and how most of that money was actually spent here in the United States. However, perception is reality in politics. This all gets much worse whenever you look at the war in Gaza. Many young Americans feel that the U.S. is complicit in a genocide, and they see U.S. aid that's being sent to Israel as morally unacceptable and that the U.S. should be punished. Never mind the fact that a lot of that aid is earmarked for fights against Iran or Hezbollah, or is defensive in nature, like its interceptor ammunition. This is the biggest example where foreign policy decisions have led to a lot of domestic anger and division. This is clearly an unsustainable situation. The end of serious American leadership may not be inevitable, but it is already underway. What was once considered to be the bedrock of global stability is now seen by many as a variable, an unpredictable variable, subject to election cycles, partisan gridlock, and geopolitical missteps. Allies no longer plan decades ahead with Washington in mind. They plan around it. They're no longer preparing for secure and strong American presidents. They're preparing for presidents that might be more antagonistic to their own leadership. And for those presidents to appoint very unserious national security staff that just love to talk on unsecure apps. Great powers rarely fall in a single catastrophic moment. More often than not, they fade. Not from war or invasion, but from internal decay and global irrelevance. And that is the danger that the United States is facing right now. The world is moving on. They're forming new institutions, new alliances, and norms that no longer wait for U.S. approval. The question is not whether or not the U.S.-led world order will return. It's whether or not the U.S. can adapt to shape what comes next, or whether it will become just another cautionary tale and a long history of fading empires. Like this video if you found it helpful or interesting. Comment what you think could be next, and if you think that the United States can manage this transition into a multipolar world order, if that is what we're heading into. Share this video with a friend if you think that they would find this interesting, and subscribe for more content, and also join the Patreon if you would like exclusive member benefits. I also created a lower tier on the Patreon. It's a $5 tier, and all you get is that weekly brief if that's all you're interested in. And there's higher tiers for other benefits. You can check it all out on the link below. With all that, I'll see you all next time. Later.